So welcome everybody to the second day of the Future Law Virtual Summit. We have Aileen Schultz today with us, who is the founder and the CEO of the Global Legal Summit. And Aileen, you are based in Toronto, and as far as I know, you are an awarded-winning business strategist with a global footprint, and this is a passion that we both share. You're creating better systems for exponential change. And your background is in research, marketing, internet strategy, having worked with different enterprises across various different sectors, including e-commerce, social network, non-profit, gaming, health, wellness, high tech, and even a specialized focus with companies and organizations across the legal sector. So I do believe that we have lots in common. And today you come here and join us for talking about the tech-enabled global democracies, which is incredibly fit to our agenda. I mean, as previously we spoke about having a legal innovation lab for blockchain governance and crypto law. And we were talking about model provisions for DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. We were also accompanied by Aaron Wright just yesterday, talking about the decentralized finances and what the laws in that segment are. So this is, I mean, incredible to have you here. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I guess I'll dive right in. And it looks like it's going to be a small group today. And so, Anya, I'd very much welcome you to engage in this conversation as well as I pour through it. And the hope is that this can be more of a discussion as opposed to just sort of like me blabbing on about things. So the more you want to engage and you know, I know we get very excited about these conversations, and so please just dive in when anything strikes your fancy, or if there was like something relevant from a session yesterday you want to touch on, please go ahead and do that. Yes, so as Anya mentioned, I founded the World Legal Summit in 2019. I also work out of the innovation labs at Thomson Reuters. That's a bit of a plug for Thomson Reuters there. So first of all, one piece of this conversation that I think often gets confused, and Anya, you probably hear this a lot too, right? Where people confuse globalization, or they think about, when they think about what is a global citizen, or they think about this interactivity between borders and stuff like that, they think about globalization. And I want to make sure that we're keeping those things distinct here, at least for this conversation, where globalization, at least in sort of like the most common view, is kind of like this commercialized view of what it means to operate globally. And largely it has to do with like business and commerce and supply chains and trade and all of these pieces. Whereas the view of global citizenship, at least historically, has been more of this philosophical concept, right? Where we're thinking about what does it truly mean to be a citizen of like humanity as a whole, as opposed to one nation state or another. Mm-hmm. And Anya, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are too on that distinction.
I mean, absolutely. We've been talking quite a lot about that with Margaret as well. Knowing that, you know, the political system as is right now, and the whole civilization basically currently operates on the notion of having the nation state. And right. Then, you know, we create these borders and we create the political discourses just based on which nation you come from. And basically in the UN, we provide one vote, one state type of a thing. So knowing that there's a lot of these global challenges that surpass the borders today, it is quite important that we do address what is by default global, what by default also surpasses those borders, and we would need to kind of create new mechanisms to understand what are the impacts, the cross-border impacts and the emissions. So yeah, on the same page, totally with you here.
Right, right. Yeah, and if there is anything that I say that you do disagree with, please, like, by all means. I love like a healthy, like, meaty discussion, you know.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. But yes, so I just wanted to make sure that that's to the viewers today very like clear that these are two like really very different things. And so I'm just gonna move some of my little windows out of the way so that I'm not blocking my screen.
So if we go just a short step back,
Yeah.
because you do want to differentiate between the global citizenship and the globalization, do you find that globalization quite often means actually the exponential growth of the communication, and we often perceive it just through the lenses of the economy, instead of really thinking about what does it mean from the the stance of democracy, or how do we actually create decision-making processes on a
Right.
global scale?
Right. Yeah. So that's exactly it. Is that I see global citizenship when we think about what does it mean to be a person, right? A person that's interoperable among states and independent of the state. And then globalization. When we think about globalization, it's more about yeah, it's more about the economy and what does it mean to be what does it mean to be a participant in a global economy? And there's very much this like politicized, um, legalized, and not that that's a bad thing, and I'll get into that later. But there's this attachment to a nation automatically built into that global participation
Mm.
in the economy, and globalization is sort of just the enhancement of that, whereas global citizenship is really this recognition of a person as should be independent of the state. It's almost like this return to natural law, right? Where we're looking at the person in their own right. So you're born into this world and you exist and you have an identity as a human being, as opposed to being this entity that has to be registered with a particular state in order to even be identifiable. And so that's really the distinction that I hope to pull apart here.
Mm-hmm,
And so when we look at that, right, and we think about global citizenship, this is actually a very old concept. And I was reading recently actually that the idea of a global citizen, or somebody sort of like the citizen of humanity, is actually a concept that's like dates way back, even sort of like pre-civilization. Well, not pre-civilization, but sort of pre-modern thinking on the topic, I guess I could say. And so when we think about this, it's largely been, or when we look at the history of it, it's largely been this thought experiment, right? So it's almost like this like hippie-esque kind of like, be one with all type of a concept that hasn't had the opportunity to really like gain traction in a practical sense. Um, and yeah, Anya, would you
No,
like
I mean, this is really interesting
to?
because first off, the natural law just came to our sessions twice in the same day. And it
Ah,
doesn't really happen often that people are going into the natural legal doctrines. It's very fascinating to hear that. And yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the global citizenship is indeed a thought experiment. And we were just having a discussion about that in the collaborative journey an hour ago, because what is happening right now is that for the first time in a history, basically, we have this generation that has become very much interconnected on a global scale. And it's almost like we're now reaching the new horizon that was
right.
previously not really visible. And because it takes a couple of generations for us to really understand where we are now really going through that thought experiment, and we are in the same process. I mean, a lot of people are talking how we are now only facing these global challenges and how we don't know how to tackle them. Of course, we don't know. I mean, this is the first
Yeah,
time that we are
yeah,
really thinking about it.
right.
Previously, it was, how did they call it? Not cosmolocal. This is something that Indra Adnan was talking about, but cosmopolitical,
Cosmopolitical. Huh.
cosmopolitan. Sorry. So the
Okay,
cosmopolitan was basically.
right. But it's this politicized view, right? Traditionally, where we think about a cosmopolitan person, right? That's traditionally somebody who is of many states, right? And so maybe it's somebody who has multiple passports, or somebody who is well versed in the world in general, right? And we think about this cosmopolitan person, whereas it seems like at least in the last few years, the dialogue has been changing to something that is less politicized and less tied in with the state, where we're starting to see this realization of an actual true global citizen, right? And that doesn't mean somebody who's attached to multiple passports. It means somebody who sort of exists in their own right as part of this like global community. And that's something that seems to be changing, right? Where we're seeing this thought experiment now, and this is something, maybe I'm jumping ahead too far, but is now starting to actually be realized.
I would be interesting to explore the idea, because what also pops my mind, especially now that you're talking about global citizenship and how people are having numerous passports and are, you know, traveling quite a lot, and don't want to be bound to one nation state particularly. What would be the difference, or could we make a comparison between the digital nomad and apatride? So a person who does not really have any place to belong to, like a person without a passport, isn't that the apatride?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something I touch on in a bit, but yeah, right. It goes to this conversation of, so the internet in a way is almost like this mock version of global citizenship, right? This mock version of global democracy, in a way where we have this interface that we can go into, and we can effectively anonymize ourselves, and we can go in, we can participate in these different discussions in multiple different jurisdictions, but as of right now, that's still jurisdictionally bound, right? So as a digital nomad, I'm not able to go between borders if I don't have a passport, right? And I'm not able to I'm not able to, if I live in a nation where there's firewalls and government surveillance and censorship and all of these things. These are things that, as a digital nomad or somebody living effectively online, and sort of my whole life operates online, I still can't escape those nation boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm literally making notes. This is incredible.
I love this stuff. I'm actually really glad that it turned out this way, with a smaller group where we could just chat about this stuff, because I think that that's far more interesting than just, you know, blabbing on about it.
And just to make sure, Naomi, Lipsa, and Idil also, if you have any thoughts on this, please do have the freedom to jump in at any time, or, you know, drop a message into the chat box.
Yeah. Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in. Cool. So moving on to the next piece. What do I have here? I've got the slide blocked. Right. And so when we think about how this is now moving into a place where it can actually be realized, at least the way that I've been viewing this, and from the bit that we have talked, I suspect you probably feel the same, is that it's really being enabled by this intersection of new law and new technology, right? When we're thinking about emerging trends and technologies that are enabling these new systems, and then we think about the new laws that are emerging to one, enable those technologies, but also to enable those new systems, right? So when we think about a global citizen, in the sense of not being necessarily bound to a nation, one nation for their identity, or legal identity anyways, what does that legal framework start to look like, right? And what are the laws that ensure that we're all coexisting in a way that is still sensible, right? And isn't complete anarchy. Was there anything you want to add to that, Anya? Oh, the slide's not going. And so, and I think you were muted there, Anya, but it looked like you were saying, no, go ahead. Yeah? Okay, great. And so at least the way we look at this at the World Legal Summit, I mean, certainly there are numerous technologies and new legal systems and things like that that are adding to this discussion and enabling this this practical application of these things, or these what have been previously thought experiments. But the way we look at it in the World Legal Summit is that we see three major categories. We call them our technology pillars. And these are categories where law and emerging technologies are intersecting, and which we, at least in the World Legal Summit, we believe that we absolutely, well, actually, I shouldn't say we subjectively, because I think this is a pretty objective statement, is that we need to, as a world, collectively come together and govern these better, right? So when we think about what are those three pillars, we have it as AI and autonomous systems, identity and decentralized technologies, and personal data governance. And so we really do see these as like almost like the gears or the wheels that are turning around and enabling these future global systems, and a true global democracy, where citizens as part of a human, just humanity in general, can participate in even political discussions or conversations about what should human rights be, or what should the law look like at a global scale, and things like this. And so we see these technologies as really enabling that. And Anya, I feel like you would 100% have something.
Yeah, my first question would be, which are the technologies that we are now talking about that are enabling? Are those the ones that you have in the circle? So the AI, autonomous systems, identity and decentralized technology, personal data governance?
Yeah, we see them. So it's kind of like this, I mean, when we look at it from the technology standpoint, yes, it's this data, it's AI and autonomous machines and systems, and then it's decentralized technologies or digital identities and those pieces. But we have these technology pillars more as an intersection of law and technology. So when we think about, I mean, AI on its own or autonomous decision-making on its own is not going to enable, for example, like universal decision-making for the global democracy or something like that, right? It absolutely has to be bound by some system of governance and legal structure. And so that's where we kind of really see this intersection in these three categories.
And system of governance, because when we are talking about the AI, for example, and we do have some questions in from the public as well.
Oh, okay.
So we can maybe address that. Also, Ramos was studying, you are talking about global citizenship, but in reality is only about the Western world. Our values will not be accepted in the Arab world or Muslim countries. And towards the end, globalism is a failure, just like communism or socialism. Economy is the only thing that can be global and accepted with limitations. We believe our moral stand are superior, and that is a mistake. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, as also. And please do feel free to unmute yourself as well and engage in this. But I want to make sure that I'm understanding what is being asked here or stated. So are you saying also that, I guess the concern here is that this concept, this idea of a global democracy, might only be realizable in the Western world, and in that sense be almost like a siloed, sort of like more of like an international democracy as opposed to a true global democracy? Is that more or less kind of what you're? Yes. Okay. Fantastic. And I would agree with that, actually. But I would say that is it's one of the challenges to overcome, right? So when we think about this, and we think about even in the Western world, right? Like take Canada, for example. I'm from Canada, Toronto, and we don't even have a digital identity system yet. And then you look at other nations, which are traditionally thought as undemocratic or with marginalized populations and issues of government corruption and things like that. And you look across those nations, several of them are already enabled by digital identity frameworks and systems. And at least when we think about a true global democracy, and again, I'll be getting into this shortly, identity really is at that core, right? And so when we think about those nations enabling digital identities, where digital identities are almost like a first step to enabling this true separation from the state. And mind you, that has to come, there's another level to that. It's not just digital identities in itself, but there's this other level to that where I'll get into in a second. But that it's almost as if these nations and I think you mentioned specifically in the Middle East, if I'm not mistaken, if these nations start to look at these technologies and take them seriously, and they start to enable them, and then they start to look at their legal frameworks, and they start to see what other nations are doing. And yes, maybe this push does come from the Western world, but I at least believe that it's possible that we could arrive at a situation where these other nations are very much being and I don't want this to come across as like culturally centric or anything like that, but if we start to look at these frameworks and they are actually happening, and we agree as a global population, inclusive of all nations, that this truly is the answer, this truly is something that will work for everyone, then it's quite possible that these other nations will start to look at their own frameworks and look at their own legal systems and see where improvements are needed. And I think you raised your hand. Did you want to unmute also?
Yes, hi.
Hello.
Well, I worked 20 years at the United Nations in political affairs, and I travel everywhere, and places like, you know, Nepal, Afghanistan, Congo. I mean, I've been in every continent, and always working with the grassroots of the population, and having an idea of a global citizenship with common values and common ideas and for the betterment of mankind. I mean, it's what we want, but also is what we want as a Western world. We think we have a moral stand. We think our ideas are right. We think that's the correct point of view, but that's not the way the other people sees it. Let's put an example. I mean, if you're Canadian or we're in Canada, you know, it's unthinkable to start labeling people in the LGBT community. It's unthinkable to discriminate, and even from childhood, we raise our kids in that way. I mean, to respect values, principles, ideas, what people want to be in their lives, whoever they want to be or whatever they want to look. You understand what I mean? But that kind of thinking is ours, and we think that's the right thing. You know, like, I mean, we believe that's the right thing, but that's not the same thing in other societies. And I don't believe for a second that we should think our way of life is the right one. I mean, whatever works for us, it may not work for others. And other societies are just as free to live the way we want. But what happened is that we leave the rest of the world. We don't interfere much, actually. And I mean, I'm talking about the Arab world, the Muslim world, Chinese, the Asians. They all live the way they want. But the Western world, and I'm talking about Europe and the Americas, because we are more like alike, we start imposing these values even in these countries. And I don't know, maybe because we were colonized by Europeans or something, we do impose a lot of cultural, social, judicial pressure in these countries, to accept the values that we believe. So we don't do the rest in the rest of the world. Now, at some point, this is dividing countries. This is creating conflict, and you see what's going on now in the U.S. with with so many movements, some of them liberal, progressive, and some other conservative, and that is also causing the same effect in a few European countries, but in a lot of South American countries as well. So at some point, when I think about that, I don't know if we, even with the best of intentions, are doing more harm than good. Maybe,
also,
yeah. Go
sorry, I apologize. We're actually just about on time with this session. And there are a few more things so Anya said we can go a bit over time here, but there are a few other key points I did want to touch on, and so just very, very quickly to address your point. First, I 100% agree with you. There's everything you said, I think, is correct, and I definitely think that in the Western world, this is something we are incredibly, incredibly guilty of, where we sort of step back and we're looking at our technology readiness, or we're looking at which, by the way, is actually incredibly behind in some domains, where other what are considered developing nations are actually far ahead when it comes to certain technologies. But that aside, we are guilty in Western cultures of exactly what you're saying. And what I would respond to that in this particular scenario, when we're talking about global citizenship and global identities and global democracy, is that at least in my view, and I can't speak to other proponents of this model, but in my view, that is coupled with independent nation views. And what I mean by that is it's not this one system, one size fits all, but it's a grouping of certain things that are agreed upon by at least majority of nations, as, for example, universal human rights and things like this, that are accepted both at the cultural level and at the political level, and the social level, by most of these nations, and that is to be partnered then with the independent cultural or political nuances that, to your point, yeah, I don't think there's any reason why there should be one nation or a group of nations that are effectively dictating or building this model. It really would have to be a coming together of all nations to agree upon what is this core that is the same. Like, what is this core that sits for all human beings, right? And largely that circles around universal human rights. And please, also, if this is something that you want to engage on further, like, please do reach out after this. There are a few key things I wanted to make sure we touched on before the session ends. One of them is that when we think about what is needed for a structure like this, right, it really is this decentralized identity that is independent of a given nation. And what I mean by that is there's this concept of self-sovereignty. And this is something that decentralized technologies like blockchain are enabling. And it's this idea that the person can be identified and can be individual and independent of the state, but they still live and operate in that state. It's just that they're not dependent on the state for their identity. And where that starts to become relevant is that let's assume I were a self-sovereign citizen and I was I had my own identity independent of a state, but I resided in, let's say Canada, for example. But when I cross borders, I'm not dependent on a Canadian passport to dictate that I went to this school or that these are my health records and my other credentials. I have ownership over that. And that's me and that's mine, independent of whether or not my particular country deems it as, oh, I see you're commenting, once again, universal human rights are not universal is what we think. Okay. Yeah, and so that's also, so that is definitely a bigger discussion. And Anya, I wonder if maybe we could even like host another webinar on this or something like that, where we discuss these things, because that, yeah, also that's an interesting statement in itself. And yes, I'm tempted to touch on that, but for the sake of getting through the next few slides, I'm going to leave that one, and maybe we can set up like a different open discussion or debate or something like that. I'd be very open to that. Anya says that's a great idea, so probably a done deal also if you're interested in engaging that. And so at the World Legal Summit, we did this review of, we didn't get to every nation. This is a work in progress, and certainly there's a margin of error here. But what we looked at is countries that have a digital identity framework are considering it. And then we looked at this scale from effectively no digital identity or no consideration of it through to decentralized identity frameworks. And we looked at that both from the legal standpoint, so are the laws enabling this, as well as the technological adoption side. So are, for example, blockchain systems even allowed in that particular nation? And then we basically rated these nations on their readiness. So their readiness for a decentralized identity system. And you actually see quite a few surprising trends here. One being that, in fact, actually, the Western world, when at least we're thinking about Canada and the United States, is actually kind of behind in this conversation. Whereas, yes, you see Europe and other places far accelerating. And Anya, please let me know if we're really needing to kind of jump off the line at any point here.
I will. We're actually waiting for the next speaker to come. So if Dan Pepper is not going to be joining us on the call in the next few minutes, you're free to continue. Basically, we kind of have a half more hour. I did have a question when you spoke about the blockchain and the readiness for other countries. You mentioned that there was one element that you took into the account when the research was done, and that is whether the regulatory framework fosters or establishes the environment where these technologies can actually be developed. And then when I think of it, I mean, the way blockchain kind of works, or it's very similar to torrent, right? You have the ability to kind of download that software and establish a node on your computer, and that can work with or without a regulation. I mean, unless the country really prohibits you to download something on your computer, it's basically still open. Was that also taken into the account, or was it really just, you know, whether we have now prescriptions that are enabling cryptocurrency use, and, you know, we have the regulations around taxes? How was this evaluated?
So we're going to be actually publishing this, this is kind of a sneak peek. We're going to be publishing this in the next probably a couple of weeks, and there we're going to show the actual index. But no, this is not by any means an incredibly deep dive. It's a very high level view, and the regulatory pieces that we look at is on the one end of the scale, whether or not digital identities are starting to be recognized, and then on the other end of the scale, it's are we or is that legal system considering other pieces of the equation, like, for example, the protection of personal data. And actually, we see a lot of nations that have these robust digital identity systems, like in terms of the technological infrastructure, but they're lacking the privacy and protection of personal data laws. And so then next level out, we look at what do those privacy laws entail? Do they look at, for example, the protection of biometric data as well? Because of course, if we look at decentralized systems, biometric data becomes critical to that identity piece. Yeah, did that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on it.
Yes, I don't doubt it. I will send it to you. I will personally send it to you
Thank you.
when we publish it. Okay, and so very much to Asa's point, there are of course many challenges that still exist around this even being a realistic thing, and one of the largest things would be global standardization. So I don't mean that in the sense of yeah, like Western prescribed or just a handful of nations coming together and saying, okay, this is what it's going to look like. I truly mean like a real global conversation and agreement on what these things should be and ought to be. And until that happens, a global democracy in the true sense of the word is not possible. And of course, actually, and this is sort of like baiting a whole new conversation, but then we do even have to ask ourselves, is a democracy something that all nations want? And so that's a whole other conversation that I will table there for our future conversations. But that, yes, these are things that need to be considered. And so when we think about the other, and I'll just touch on these pieces very lightly, but when we think about the other parts of this equation, so beyond identity and decentralized systems or technologies, we look at also AI and autonomous systems as great enablers that also could be devastating if they're not, if we don't come to agreement on global standards in terms of how these technologies are being adopted and used, particularly when we think about autonomous decision making. And on the same token, autonomous decision making, when we think about AI enabled smart contract systems, for example, and these other systems that are enabling decision making independent of humans, this is where we also start to arrive at the possibility of a truly independent decision making or legal system from, for example, a corrupt and biased judiciary or something like this, right? We really are starting to see how these technologies can create these truly independent systems. And of course, there are loads of ethical and technical considerations that need to be not only considered, but obviously addressed in the very real and practical sense of the word before any of this is ever even possible. And largely that is currently there's a lot of bias in AI systems and other issues that absolutely have to be resolved before something like this can move forward. And then lastly, of course, then when we think about being a global citizen and participating in a global democracy, we are talking about individual people, right? We're talking about the person and all of the data, both physical as well as digital and all other pieces of data that surround that person. And then how are we governing that data? Because at the end of the day, we're still a person, independent, sure, as ourselves, but we're involved in, or we participate in a global democracy and or a global community. And in that respect, we do have to ensure that one, we ourselves are being bound's a very strong word, but we do have some governance structures in place overall, but also that we as ourselves, as independent people, are being protected, and that our data is not, of course, not being jeopardized in any way in these systems. Now, that was a very rushed, high-level discussion of all of these pieces. But Anya, is there anything before we close out that you think we should touch on here, or?
I was wondering with the AI, right? establishing those mechanisms or at least rules around that, I mean, how far are we with that? Because, for example, you have, I forgot how it's called. It's a Russian application that you can download, and the application basically gathers a lot of data about you from different social media. And while you are talking to that AI, because it kind of is a robot that talks back to you, it's just like a bot sort of a thing. But by collecting all that data and by responding to me and by collecting my responses to the system back, they are possibly able to create almost like my digital twin or at least digital match. And how far away are we from establishing different, at least ethical rules on that topic? Because it does seem to me that we have only the rules on very high level, but not really like particularly established around these apps that are already collecting our data.
Yeah, and that's sadly we're not very far along at all. So when we think about at least AI and the adoption of AI and the development of these technologies and how different jurisdictions are governing or holding companies accountable for their actions or the actions of their machines effectively and things like that, it's incredibly immature. And that's kind of like the greatest issue here, is because when we think about what does it look like 10 years from now when we haven't come together globally to come across mandatory or to develop mandatory standards for these things. Right now, all we really have are enterprise level, even standards is a very strong word, but a lot of companies, and Thomson Reuters is one of them, have created principles or guidelines that the company hopes to operate by and hopes to fulfill in their development of these technologies. And nations very much have a similar thing, where you look at the nation level, what is being done, or the federal level, what is being done to actually govern this work, right? Like the development of these technologies and to protect people and to protect their data. And largely what you'll see is that what exists is really just principles and guidelines. And more than that, oftentimes these principles and guidelines are more about how do we as a nation foster the talent and the development and research of these technologies, so that we can effectively win or compete in this global AI market, or whatever you want to call it, whereas they're not considering in too great of detail the actual regulatory framework that is needed for these technologies. And so, yeah, there is sadly a great disconnect, and that's something that we of course hope to build discussion.
So I hear the word sadly, so I'm just curious, is your positioning and viewpoint that there should be some stronger regulation, sort of a hard law instead of having approached with a soft laws?
Well, so and that's when I'm always hesitant to like, because you could look at this and think that that's yeah. So yes, to answer your question short, yes, I do think that is absolutely needed here. And I do think that because of what we're dealing with and the implications of not having sound governance structures and regulatory environments for these technologies, what we're dealing with, if we don't put those in place, is potentially devastating. And so when we think about that, yes, I do think that for this particular domain of technology, we do need hard and fast rules about how exactly these can be developed and how exactly our data can be used, and these pieces, before it's too late. Now, the caveat to that is that I am also a huge proponent of technological innovation and accelerated innovation. And I'm a huge believer that in order for us to solve some of the world's greatest challenges with these technologies, we need to have them out there growing, adapting, and especially when it comes to AI, learning from the environment. And in order for these technologies to get better, they do need to be out there and evolving. And so it's not that, I think I'll stop there before I before I veer on the end of saying something that I might not quite mean. Yeah.
Thank you for
We need
that.
both.
I mean,
we need both. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, that was an extensive response already. Do we have any questions from the audience before I jump in again with another question? Because I believe there's plenty of more that we could discuss. But I am very curious. If we have any questions from the audience, please raise your hand or put a question directly into the chat. Otherwise, Aileen, I'm going to be a bit lazy here and I'm going to ask you a question. What is the most common question that you get with regard to your job? Because you seem to be very much connected to all these different sectors, and as a lawyer that deals with, you know, system thinking, I mean, that is quite necessary. But what is like the common question that you get?
About which thing? maybe we narrow it down. Is there like yeah, about which thing?
All right. Okay, so let's start with the World Legal Summit. How do you operate? I mean, I saw the brochures that you were creating, the books, and I do recommend looking into those because I was quite surprised how into detail you went with all the people that you've gathered. There were a couple of reports about how, for example, how do we deal with personal data around the world, and I was surprised to see that there was a lot of people from Africa, for example, coming into that research group. How do you operate?
Yeah, so so that is one of the most common questions that we get. So there you go, got it. Yeah, so so we're a community-driven platform, right? So we don't have, like, we very much operate from the standpoint of trying our best to be decentralized, but there's a central component to that, and that's templated and then operationalized across all the different jurisdictions. And so the way we operate is we have host locations in the different jurisdictions, and that is to get that local, and again to Asa's point, to get that localized discussion and cultural understanding from those people themselves. So not as an independent researcher who's sitting over in some other country looking in on the internet, but as somebody who truly practices, whether it be law or a technologist who's actually developing these technologies, truly works in that jurisdiction. And so yeah, and so we get the local discussion, and then we build that into the centralized global view and understanding.
How does somebody actually become part of that collaboration? Do you have any advice? Because we here in Future Law Virtual Summit, I mean, not only are we creating a virtual summit for everybody to join on one platform, get all the links so that everybody can join the Zoom links, Zoom rooms, but we are also being very mindful that, you know, the change that we want to observe is not going to be happening in these 5 days. We are here for a long run. We do want to kind of foster or create a collaboration that is going to be happening on a monthly basis, have a bit of a higher frequency. Do you have any advice? How is that collaboration, for example, happening in the World Legal Summit, and how might the lawyers, legal professionals that are joining us co-create that together?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is just to do the best you can. This is something we're still working on too, full disclosure, in the World Legal Summit, to get those disparate views in the equation, right? So ensuring that you have both the views, and again, this is something that we, yes, we've done a decent job so far of bringing these things, building these bridges, but it's something we need to continue working on. For example, we have a huge gap in the Middle East in terms of participation and involvement. And so I mean, I would say, and this is something anybody, any organization working on these things needs to look at, is how do we include all the voices in that, both from the legal side, the technology side, so ensuring that when we're looking at legal frameworks about a given technology. We're not just a bunch of lawyers in a room, and I mean this we in sort of like a general sense. I'm not actually a lawyer myself, but how do we ensure that we're also including then the voice of the AI developer, who can sit there and say, this doesn't make any sense, people, this isn't going to work in practice, and here's why. And then the same thing when it comes to jurisdictional views, right? So recognizing and being transparent where there's gaps. And so for us, for example, we do have certain jurisdictional gaps that we're hoping to continue fleshing out over time, and just ensuring that we have those local views and those local voices involved.
Sounds good. I mean, sounds like something that we would like to achieve together. So
Yes,
let's join the efforts as soon as possible.
absolutely,
I
absolutely.
was also thinking yesterday we had Michelle Zappa. If you had the time, I do recommend you look at the presentation that he has presented to us yesterday. It was about the cities and how he collects data and makes it visually presentable or a bit more attractive to the eye. Because as soon as he started, and he started about 10 years ago, it was 2011, he basically had a lot of these different technologies that he wanted to talk about, and all of a sudden he ended up with having it graphically presented as a network, or you know, as a some sort of a snail with different circles. And at that point he started understanding that we really need to improve the visualization of the data, and this is where he created the envisioning. Maybe you even know of him?
No, not him specifically, but on that, so something that this is sort of like a little bit back to your common question comment that you made earlier. So working in these spaces, and you probably experienced this as well, especially in law, right? When we're talking about these different technologies, they're very poorly understood, right? And it's very difficult to get that understanding out there. And so something that I've found very helpful is taking these abstract technologies like blockchain, like AI, and ensuring that we have visualizations, right? Visualizations that make sense to people. And so for blockchain, for example, this one company I worked with a while ago built this blockchain application, and it was really just this Word document, and it really just showed you every time a change was being hashed, and it just had this little side panel, and it just showed what change was being effectively written to the ledger. And in that way, when people looked at that, they almost instantaneously got it. And so it's kind of like this really visualization is critical, I would say. Yeah.
Especially the more complex we become.
Yes.
Absolutely needed. I mean, one of the things that we were discussing right before the summit was also that we would very much like to have a person that presents what is happening in the summit graphically, almost like composing a comic book for us.
Yes.
I mean, those types of things are definitely needed. And there's going to be a lady joining us at the summit explaining the cartoon legal framework, or at least cartoon legal contracts. I don't really know yet what this is all going to be about, but I'm eager to hear more about whether we can really create a contract in a virtual, not virtual, but in a comical sense. And then, and on Tuesday, which is the last day of the summit, we're going to have a demo presentation of the open law, which is very similar to Riccardian contracts, since we're talking about blockchain. Ross Campbell is going to be joining us to present us what the open law is doing with contracts. Apparently, they're putting contracts on the blockchain and are enabling a couple of transactions to be automatically done. So sort of say they're creating a digital twin for all the legal contracts. So it's no longer just a program in terms of the smart contracts that enables these transactions, as in cryptocurrencies being sent from point A to point B, but literally like I'm putting down the articles of a contract, and then this is being displayed and automatically executed. So join us if you have the time. Join us. It's going to be in the evening hours on Tuesday. So it's going to be possible for you to attend, because it's not going to be early in the morning. You're calling us from Canada, right?
Sorry?
You're calling us from Canada?
Yes, Toronto.
All right.
Toronto,
Oh,
Canada.
Toronto, yeah. Great. Yeah, so join us. We'll be sending all the links and make everything ready. And people, if you want to get your replays for these sessions, please do register for Explorer Plus, Negotiator, or Master Ticket, because those are going to be providing you the access to all the replays, all the video content, as soon as we top and tail it, as our film crew actually says it. Every time we do create a recording, we need to top and tail the recording. And we're going to be putting that on the platform, thenegotiatingthenewnormal.com. So please welcome everybody to see the replays of these sessions.